History 2 video lecture. This is Chapter 27, Romantic Opera and Musical Theater to Mid-Century. So we're talking about early 1800s to the middle of the 1800s. Technically, of course, by most definitions, the Romantic era doesn't start until 1820, but you can see we're actually going to overlap a little bit there. So, first of all, the first half of the 19th century, that is to say the 1800s, was a time of great growth in theater in general. There were new opera theaters erected all over Western Europe. By Western Europe, we're talking about Germany, France, Belgium, into Spain. That, basically everything that's not present-day Poland and further east. Opera became incredibly popular, not just among the nobility and the wealthy, which, understand, up until the Romantic era, opera was more or less the province of the wealthy. While there were public opera theaters, as we've talked about in class, the first one opened in Venice in 1637, and comic opera, of course, became very popular among the middle and lower classes. For the most part, serious opera and large, lavish productions were more or less reserved for the wealthy. However, what we start to see happening is some pretty interesting stuff. Composers and publishers, instead of just holding on to the music for public performances by professionals, now start to publish reductions, excerpts from these operas, and complete scores of these operas published for voice and piano. Today, this is something that's fairly common. If you're a singer, there's a very good chance that you've sung opera arias with piano reduction. Well, that didn't start to happen until the first part of the 1800s. So, people would perform these. They would perform these at parties with friends. They would perform them at home. They would perform them out in salons as gathering places. Complete operas were transcribed for piano, just piano by itself even. And both overtures and arias begin to be programmed on concert programs. When I'm talking about concert programs, I'm talking about symphony orchestra concerts, obviously not the opera, but what they started to do is some of these opera overtures began to be detached from the operas that they were written for and performed in the concert hall, as well as arias. An orchestra would bring in a guest singer, and the singer would perform some of the favorite arias from certain operas with the orchestra accompanying them, unstaged. So, opera grew massively both within the theater and outside of the theater. By 1850, now that's something we've talked about in the previous chapter and will continue to talk about. I frequently in this class use the term standard repertoire or permanent repertoire. By 1850, we start to establish the core of the permanent operatic repertoire. Now, some composers who come later get added to this core, and some operas that were originally very popular eventually became less popular and dropped out of what we think of as being the standard rep, and other ones get added. But what we start to see happen by the middle of the 1800s, by approximately 1850, is that we start to establish this core repertoire, paralleling the development we talked about in Chapter 26 of this rise in older music being performed more frequently. Opera. Why was opera popular? Well, there was this wave of nationalism throughout Europe, people taking pride in their individual countries. A lot of it grew out after the Napoleonic Wars, when armies, before that, a lot of time armies were paid mercenaries. Now we're starting to see the common people of the country are being drafted into the military to fight for their country. The general definition of nationalism is an attempt to unify a group of people through shared characteristics and traditions. Musically, we will see how this takes place. It's a very popular movement throughout the Romantic era in instrumental music and in opera. The opposite of nationalism is exoticism. Exoticism is when you write music that attempts to evoke the sounds, the feelings, the impressions of a foreign country, typically a country that the audience is not going to be familiar with. The funny thing about exoticism is, a lot of times exoticism isn't even particularly accurate. But if the audience in France thinks it sounds Spanish, or if the audience in Italy thinks it sounds Japanese, then it's exoticism, even if maybe it's not entirely accurate, historically or musicologically speaking. So, in the second half of the 19th century, nationalism and exoticism become real motivating forces in all music, and particularly in opera. All right, so let's start with Rossini. Rossini was certainly the most famous opera composer of his time, and maybe the most famous composer, period, in the 1820s, maybe with the exception of Beethoven. We always have to make Beethoven the exception. He wrote 39 operas, several of which are still today in the permanent repertoire. The Italian Woman in Algiers was written in 1813. That was his first major international success. The Barber of Seville, written in 1816. That's a comic opera, and is today his most performed opera. Heck, Bugs Bunny did his own parody of The Barber of Seville. That's how popular it was. And then William Tell was his last major opera, which he composed only when he was in his late 30s. William Tell was an opera seria about a Swiss patriot who famously had to shoot an apple with a bow and arrow, shoot an apple from his son's head. William Tell, the overture, well, we'll get to that. The overture is incredibly popular today. The opera is still performed, although the overture has far outstripped the actual opera in performance. He retired at age 40. He actually became a gourmand. He loved good food and good wine. And from what I understand, I believe he died, he was extremely obese. But he essentially didn't compose anything after age 40. So, you know, for the last 36 years of his life, he basically only composed the first half of his life. All right, so what is so popular about Rossini? Why was opera so popular at the time? Why do they continue to be popular today? Well, a couple reasons. One of them is that he blended serious opera, opera seria, with comic opera, opera buffa. Bear in mind that Rossini's operas pretty much were in Italian, even though he was writing in France. A lot of the time his operas were in Italian, so opera seria, opera buffa are their proper terms for that. This is something that he didn't necessarily start. We've talked about Mozart's operas and how Mozart blended aspects of serious and comic opera in some of his operas. Rossini ran with that. He established a whole style of singing, which even today is considered to be one of the prevailing singing movements, which is referred to simply as bel canto. Bel canto translates as beautiful singing or beautiful voice. It refers to characteristics of the music that Rossini wrote and the way that he wanted them to be sung. Rossini's music, his bel canto, led to Donizetti and other composers, which established this bel canto tradition very firmly. It's characterized by lyrical lines. The music is very lyrical and is supposed to be sung very, very beautifully. The singer is supposed to sound effortless. No matter how high or difficult the music is, it's supposed to sound completely unstrained. Florid delivery. The music sometimes has quite a bit of ornamentation in it, and when you sing it, you're supposed to sing it, while it's supposed to sound effortless, you're supposed to sing it in a very expressive and outgoing manner. It's a style of singing that has been around now for 200 years. In class, we will listen to some Rossini, we'll listen to a couple of arias, but I can't leave Rossini without mentioning his overtures. As I said, overtures began to become popular just performed in concert, and Rossini's overtures are the most popular overtures played in concert today. I'm not sure there's another composer whose overtures get played as frequently in concert programs as Rossini's. Specifically, well, these three of his really important operas, William Tell Overture, trust me, you'll recognize it in a heartbeat if you don't already know what I'm talking about. Italian in Algiers is a wonderful overture. It's very fun, it's a very clever overture. The Barber of Seville Overture, which again, you'll recognize in an instant if I start to play it for you. And La Gazda Ladra, which is from his opera, La Gazda Ladra, which means the thieving magpie. It's a story basically about a magpie, a bird, flies in and steals a shiny bracelet or brooch from the table of a woman of the nobility, she blames the maid. So it's actually kind of about class struggle. The opera is performed, but the overture is performed very frequently. So Rossini led to Bellini. So Vincenzo Bellini was 9 years Rossini's junior, although he died before him because Bellini died only at age 34. But remember, Rossini retired by age 40. So Rossini's last major opera was written in 1829. Bellini's music kind of came in and replaced Rossini in the current repertoire that was being performed. Same thing. Long, beautiful, florid melodies, intensely emotional, many embellishments in his music. He continued the bel canto tradition that Rossini had helped to establish. He wrote 10 operas, remember he died only at age 34. But of these operas, these three, The Sleepwalker, Norma, and The Puritans, are all in the core repertoire. And certain arias from these, we'll listen to Costa Diva from Norma, are in the core aria repertoire as well. So, we will listen to this. I'll break this down in class. I mean, don't need to spend any time on this score right now. So, kind of concurrent with these gentlemen, with Rossini, slightly younger than Rossini, slightly older than Bellini, is Donizetti. Donizetti was very productive, incredibly productive, much more so even than Rossini. Of course, as I mentioned, Rossini retired young. Wrote over 70 operas, wrote over 100 songs. He wrote instrumental music. He wrote symphonies. But he is best known today. I've never heard a Donizetti symphony. I'm not saying they're not performed. They're just not part of the standard core repertoire. But some of his operas absolutely are. Lucia di Lammermoor, absolute core repertoire. The Daughter of the Regiment, opera comique, French comic opera, absolute core of the repertoire. Don Pasquale, opera buffa, Italian comic opera. These are performed all over the world. As a matter of fact, right now, while I'm recording this at 5:07 p.m. on a Friday, someone somewhere in some time zone is probably performing one of Donizetti's operas, or just finished. So, these operas, the really successful operas by these three gentlemen, Rossini, Bellini, and Donizetti, the bel canto composers, performed in their time all over Europe, in the Americas. As a matter of fact, this repertoire kind of introduced opera to America. People would actually tour. Companies would tour around America, going out into the West and into very small towns, performing shows that included a lot of these arias. The arias, well, as I said, you'll recognize some of these arias immediately. They became so popular, they were sung everywhere, not just in the opera, not just in the concert hall, but everywhere. So they've kind of become almost popular music, almost folk music in a way. They're so well known. And, as I said, their operas, some of their operas, have become core operatic repertoire. Those are the Italians. The French composers. Now, Meyerbeer kind of drove this concept of French grand opera. He was German, but he lived in Paris, and he established this whole genre of French grand opera. Grand opera, it's a large undertaking, typically in 5 acts. Huge. So Robert the Devil and the Huguenots. The Huguenots is in the core repertoire today, much more so than Robert le Diable, although they are both performed. But the Huguenots is in the rep. So, what is it about French grand opera? As I said, 5 acts, a large cast, scenery, extensive scenery, and lighting effects, trying to, well, special effects, like a movie today is known for special effects. The Huguenots is a tragedy. It's set in France in the 1500s, and grand opera is really all about this massive spectacle of the sets, the large cast, and the special effects, the lighting effects, and combined with beautiful vocal, beautiful melodies, and great large scenes with fantastic singing in them. French grand opera, it's an interesting genre. It self-limits because smaller opera companies can't typically afford to stage some of these operas. They call for a much larger cast than some of the Italian operas I was just referring to. But, as I said, some of them are in the repertoire. Specifically, the Trojans, the Trojans of Carthage, by Hector Berlioz. It is a grand opera, although it does have aspects reaching back even before Meyerbeer to Lully. It's an interesting opera. I saw it performed at the Metropolitan Opera once. Long, huge cast, lots of dancers. It's incredibly complicated athletic dance scene in the middle. The Trojans, what were the Trojans? What we're talking about, the Aeneid by Virgil. So he adapted the libretto from that. Berlioz wrote his own libretto. And it's very involved. Not only are there your typical recitatives, arias, choruses, but there are also ballets. A ballet is a dance, a staged dance during an opera. It can be simple. A ballet can be something as simple as people waltzing around the stage during a party, for example, with the orchestra playing the accompaniment. Or in the case of some operas, Verdi, of course, did this a lot, with the accompaniment being played by an off-stage band. To an incredibly involved and complicated and athletic scene. The production of Le Troyon that I saw involved dozens of dancers and standing backflips and just a lot of really difficult and complicated stuff. One poor dancer actually tried a standing backflip and face planted. I'll remember that probably the rest of my life. Which leads us to ballet as its own genre. Ballet had been around. Classical dance had been around in France since the 1600s, but in the Romantic era, it kind of took on a new meaning. Maria Taglioni introduced this new style of ballet during the Romantic, which became incredibly popular in France and spread all throughout Europe. Russia, especially, became obsessed with this style of Romantic ballet, and really, since the mid-1800s, I think Russia has been the Bolshoi. In Russia has been thought to be kind of the pinnacle of classical ballet in the world. The ballerinas, the prima ballerina, the lead dancer, people would write roles specifically for her, and that you had to be a great dancer, but you also had to have incredible grace in addition to the athleticism that dance requires. They wore what we think of as traditional ballet today's tutus, and the toe shoes that allow them to stand on point. That all came in during this era. Taglioni introduced this ballet, as I said, Russia, throughout Europe, and even into North America. So what we think of when we think of traditional ballet, that came out of France in the middle of the 1800s. And we'll talk about certain composers who are famous for their ballets as we go on. Leo Delibes, of course, in Russia, Tchaikovsky wrote many ballets that are incredibly popular. So as kind of we go through, we'll focus on what are specifically ballets as opposed to other staged works like operas. Okay, so mentioned Italy, mentioned France. Let's talk about German. So in Germany, because of the language, when people wrote opera in German, it was very important that the music be written properly to be sung in German. The obsession with music and text in German music predates this, but especially when you think of art songs that we talked about in chapter 25, I believe, and into German opera, it becomes very important that you text set correctly. Singspiel, German comic opera, which we know came about in the early 1700s, integrated elements of French opera with nationalist musical tendencies that we saw in Singspiel. Eventually, this grew into a new genre of German opera. The most important German opera composer in this era was Carl Maria von Weber. Now, von Weber, in addition to writing operas, wrote quite a bit of other music. He wrote a clarinet concerto, which is very, very popular. He wrote a French horn concertino, which is very, very popular. He also wrote orchestral music. So Weber was an excellent composer. His music is performed very frequently today. From an operatic perspective, his opera, which was first performed in 1821, the Freeshooter, what kind of established this new German style of opera. The plots are drawn from German medieval history and legends. Eventually, Weber was a big influence on the man who is considered to be the greatest German opera composer of all, of course, who we'll talk about in the second half of the Romantic era, Richard Wagner. Without Weber, Wagner couldn't have done everything that he did. So, the Freischütz, Eurythmy, and Oberon, all of these are in the repertoire, although they're not performed as frequently as the Italian bel canto, but they are all in the repertoire. There's Carl Maria von Weber. In Russia, now this is very interesting to me, when we talk about nationalism in the Romantic era. Nationalism, of course, you saw musical nationalism, you saw all across Europe and all countries. But in Russia, it was especially interesting, because Russia in some ways was like America only 100 years earlier. What Russia was doing was importing musicians from Europe. So the opera companies in Russia were foreign. They were bringing in outside performers to perform foreign operas. Whenever a Russian did compose an opera, it basically imitated what was going on in other countries. The first National Opera Company was established in St. Petersburg, 1755. It did give, they did present Russian operas, but no operas predating the early 1800s are performed anywhere today, maybe not even in Russia. Now, the Tsar was the dictator of Russia. It's sometimes spelled T-S-A-R, not just C-Z-A-R. The Tsar was the dictator of Russia. The emperor ruled Russia with an absolute iron fist. Didn't matter who was Tsar, they were in charge. And the Tsars, like dictators in many countries, used the arts as a way to consolidate their own power. If they could control what was being staged in the operas and what was being published musically and performed musically, that gave them another grip on people's hearts and minds, basically. So the Tsar actually used opera as a tool to reinforce his own dictatorship. All of this kind of leads us to Glinka. Mikhail Glinka is the father of modern Russian music in many ways. Before Glinka, most Russian composers, as I said, were imitating Europeans. Glinka was the first Russian composer who said, hey, we've got these amazing traditions, amazing musical traditions in Russia, folk music traditions. He had started to incorporate those into his music, which made him incredibly successful in Russia and also made him the first Russian composer with an international presence. Fast forward 100 years to America, I'm jumping way ahead of myself here, but in America 100 years later, give or take, American composers were simply imitating European composers, sounding like second-rate Tchaikovskys and third-rate Brahmses, before they developed their own style, focusing on American styles of music, which led us to eventually composers like Aaron Copland, George Gershwin, William Grant Still, etc. So Glinka's opera, A Life for the Tsar, was written in 1836. It was very pro-government. It was very pro-Tsar. It's really interesting. When we talk about Shostakovich, we're actually going to, it's going to take us back to a scene from Russian opera of the mid-century. Life for the Tsar is the first Russian opera that incorporated recitative instead of spoken dialogue. If you think back to comic opera, this is certainly not a comic opera, but if you think back to comic opera, how many of them utilize spoken dialogue instead of recitative. This is the first Russian opera that was sung throughout. That, however, is not in the core repertoire necessarily. Ruslan in Ludmilla, composed in 1842, is very much in the core repertoire. It is based on a poem by Pushkin. Pushkin is one of the great Russian historical figures, literary figures in their history. It's a really cool opera, actually. There's a lot of really neat stuff in it. It's chromatic. He utilizes some scales. Now, this is some of this Russian folk music making its way into classical music with the utilization of whole tone scales, and we start to hear other scales. These scales, actually, now I'm jumping ahead of myself again, but one of the influences on Claude Debussy 50 years later in France was Russian music. He heard some of these exotic scales and built a whole musical movement on them. So Glinka eventually leads us to gentlemen we're going to talk about in a future chapter, known as the Russian Five. This was a group of composers who were strongly influenced by Glinka and by his use of Russian folk music and folk melodies. So this is just a brief overview of what's happening operatically in Europe and Russia in the first part of the 1800s. As I said, the Italian bel canto is incredibly important. Carl Maria von Weber, Meyerbeer, Hector Berlioz's only French grand opera, and eventually leading us into Russia to Glinka. In class, we will listen to examples from all of these operas, and we will break some of the scores down and see exactly what's what.